Good morning and welcome to WP Intelligence Weekly Friday Briefing. I'm Yun-Hee Kim, Deputy Editor of WP Intelligence. Today we have a fascinating topic we'll be diving into, the race to dominate biotech. China's growing biotech industry is challenging the US for global dominance. Last year, China accounted for 30% of novel drugs in the worldwide pipeline. Faster and cheaper clinical trials conducted in China are raising concerns about US national security, access to critical medicines, and dominance of a lucrative industry, especially at a time when AI is expected to accelerate the discovery of new drugs. Today, we're going to discuss some of the challenges to drug development in the United States and new steps the Trump administration is taking to address them. Before we begin the discussion, a quick note about WP Intelligence. We're a new kind of media built for executives and policymakers who need insight to help them see around corners of policy and industry trends. Our subscribers receive concise intelligence reports with actionable recommendations across AI and tech, energy and climate, global security, and healthcare, exclusive interviews and data graphics, as well as live briefings like this, where we sort out developments that are changing the business and policy landscape. Today, we have three expert guests to help us navigate the way forward on drug development in the US. Rebecca Adams is our lead healthcare analyst. She has recently published a report on the Trump administration tackling drug development bottlenecks. Thomas Bollyky is the inaugural Bloomberg Chair in Global Health at the Council of Foreign Relations, where he directs the Global Health Program. And Jocelyn Ulrich is Vice President of Policy and Research at the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, where she is responsible for developing legislative and policy analysis. She also develops research studies impacting biopharmaceutical companies, including intellectual property, FDA policy issues, and the R&D process. Thank you all for being here. So here's how we're going to organize our conversation for the next hour. First, we'll talk about the growing role China's playing in pharmaceutical development, how it got there, and the implications for the US. Second, we'll discuss some of the bottlenecks in the US drug development process and a new federal initiative to address them. And third, we'll also discuss what these challenges will mean for drug companies, the FDA, and patients. And I'd like to thank our audience for the questions you sent ahead of the briefing. We have used them to help shape this conversation today. Throughout this discussion, I also invite you to please drop your questions and comments in the Q&A, and we'll take relevant questions as we go along. So let's get to it. Rebecca, I'd like to start with you. You recently wrote a report for us titled "The Trump Administration Tackles Drug Development Bottlenecks." Let's start with the context, which comes in two parts: the promise of AI and the acceleration in China. Talk about the high hopes AI has raised for drug breakthroughs.
Well, thank you, Yun-Hee, and thank you to our guests. We're so happy to have these experts joining us. So drug development is very expensive and time-consuming. It can take a decade or more to bring a drug to market, and AI has the potential to help with that. It can sift through enormous amounts of data. It can scan through scientific literature. It can help design clinical trial protocols. It can help recruit patients. It can do a lot of different things. It can monitor the safety of drugs after they're on the market. And so there are a lot of people who are looking to AI to make a difference. And we have seen advances in the past few years. We saw that Google DeepMind created a new tool called AlphaFold that can predict the structure of proteins and their 3D structures based on the amino acid sequences. And we've seen a lot of investment flow to this as well. Last year, there was about $4 billion that flowed in from venture capitalists to AI drug discovery. So it's getting a lot of attention, and there are high expectations.
So a lot of money flowing in. Thomas, why is the US government so concerned about this progress? Is it not a good thing for the world if more countries are developing more drugs?
The concern for U.S. policymakers arises from the fact that U.S. dependence on China for our essential medicines has become structural. Deeper, broader, more consequential than prior analyses would suggest. My colleagues and I at the Council on Foreign Relations just spent the last year on a blue ribbon report looking at choke points in the U.S. pharmaceutical supply chain. And what that shows is that dependence that began with generic medicines and their ingredients has now grown into first in human trials, biologic manufacturing, and synthetic DNA. It is a dependence that is not just the result of market conditions, but rather decades of coordinated Chinese state investment that has involved a coordinated statewide campaign that has incorporated regulatory overhauls, subsidies, dedicated biotech hubs, but also other forms of government support on a scale that few other nations can match, including joint venture requirements, conditioned marketing approval to compel the effective transfer of intellectual property. It's going to need a coordinated and sustained response to overcome that. And we say in this report, and others have said as well, that at this point, the US pharmaceutical and biotechnology supply chains face a threat equal to that posed by China's exploitation of its dominance of critical minerals. And it's going to require the same level of urgency and resources. And we're starting to see that from US policymakers.
And Jocelyn, like one interesting development has been that, and Thomas alluded to this as well, is that more U.S. companies are actually doing their clinical trials in China. What is driving that activity, and how is that being achieved?
Yeah, there's no question that right now China has a comparative advantage, in particular in this early phase, phase one research. They are highly successful at translating lab results into the clinic and recruiting and completing phase one studies about 50% faster and 40% cheaper than the United States is currently able to do that. So as a result, there are many promising scientific candidates coming out of China, and their science is quite advanced. You know, as Thomas said, there's been a very coordinated, sustained effort to improve the scientific infrastructure in China, and so they are now more than ever contributing a significant amount of the first-in-class pipeline assets globally that are attracting a lot of investment from U.S. companies and venture capital as well.
Mm-hmm. We do have an audience question. The question is, to what extent does the Chinese government underwrite China's biotech companies? Are the biggest ones also SOEs, state-owned enterprises? Thomas, do you want to answer that question?
Sure. Let me at least take first stab at it. Heavily. This has been a priority under China industrial policy. So you've seen definitely in some cases, some of these Chinese companies are closely associated with the state. But this has been outlined really for decades and continues to be a focused area of Chinese state intervention. Again, some of that is positive around supporting, in some cases, appropriate regulatory streamlining, supporting the coordination and support of science. But some of it has ventured into skirting appropriate concerns around intellectual property and regulatory rigor. And that has led to concerns, particularly on the part of US policymakers, about the way that state intervention is being directed in this sector.
So there are both positives and negatives. Are there any lessons to be learned from how China is rolling their policy initiatives out for the US to potentially adapt?
I would say absolutely. And we've seen FDA take some action in this regard. Policymakers are also looking comprehensively at this, but we need to ensure that the U.S. remains the best place to invest in the discovery, development, and manufacturing of innovative medicines. There really is no question that China has had this very consistent focus on this area. As Thomas has pointed out, the ambition there is to dominate biotechnology, and so the U.S. needs to have the same focus. Now, we are still in the lead, absolutely. We are still spending more. We are producing more. 70% of novel medicines are first approved by the U.S. FDA currently. But to maintain that lead, we do need a concerted effort. I think the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology came out with a very comprehensive report in the end of 2025 outlining many of the same concerns that Thomas and his colleagues pointed out in their report, with a number of policy actions that need to be taken up across the entire spectrum of the R&D ecosystem, everything from phase 1 trials all the way to manufacturing. So absolutely, I think the response here has to be to ensure that we have a commensurate response to how China has approached this, to ensure that the U.S. can maintain its leadership position.
Can I just jump in and say that, look, what China is doing is really working for them. I mean, look at where they were 15 years ago and look at where they are now. It's a huge difference. And they really, as Thomas mentioned, they put this in their 5-year plans. They really have prioritized scientific advancements, not just in drug discovery, but also in quantum and AI and other fields. And so they are making huge strides. It's not just also clinical trials that are being done in China, but we're also seeing these licensing deals that have really taken off. McKinsey gave me a little bit of data, and they said that China accounted for about 24% of novel trials being tested in 2023, and just 2 years later, it was 30%. And we are seeing these licensing deals that they hit a record high last year. So in 2022, there were about 42 of these deals between a Chinese company and another company outside of China. And then in 2025, there were 92, and that is continuing this year. So you have to look at what China is doing, and they are just making enormous progress in where they were compared to where they were.
And Rebecca, that is...
Yeah. Sorry, I was going to just expand on that point for a moment. So this is important both in terms of what China has been able to accomplish and the point that part of the approach from the US has to be an ecosystem approach that makes it more suitable for best-in-class science to occur here. But one of the major themes that emerges from the report is we do need both an offense and a defense in this space. We need to see that ecosystem approach to trying to make it easier to conduct first-in-human trials here, as well as to have adequate support for scientific enterprise. But there also needs to be more scrutiny over China, its licensing activities, and the way that it's been conducting clinical trials and appropriate enforcement on a risk-based status, to have scrutiny over the validity, the ensuring those trials are ethically conducted and according to good clinical practice. And we have not always had that. And it's going to be important moving forward that we both have those defensive measures to appropriately give oversight over what China is doing in this space, to ensure the best science and the safety of patients, as well as investing in the US biopharmaceutical ecosystem.
I'd say the good news for us. Sorry.
Go ahead.
The good news for us in this moment is that as we are, the licensing and the partnering that is happening does ensure that for the moment, US companies are engaged in the development of this science. They are ensuring an oversight, and so American patients are able to benefit. So that is one of the positives of being able to take advantage of this promising science in this moment. Thomas is absolutely correct. We do need to ensure that this is being done according to global best standards. We need to ensure compliance with good clinical practice. And the good news there as well is that FDA does have authority to go and on a risk-based basis inspect those sites. They can go and audit. Now, maybe they haven't been doing as much as they are able to, and we would be very supportive of additional oversight, inspections, and FDA fully using its authority to do so, because compliance with GCP and ensuring that this data is quality is critically important. But in the short run, I think the caution that I would put into the conversation here is that policy responses could be too broad and too abrupt. So we do want to make sure that right now, US patients, US companies are still able to participate in this science, to have some control over the process, and that American patients are still able to benefit.
This gives us a really good transition to talk a little bit about this new initiative from the Department of Health and Human Services called the Operation TrialBlazer. So, Rebecca, can you tell us a little bit about what that is and what the government's going to try to do about it for the U.S. to catch up again right now?
Sure. There have been a lot of behind the scenes conversations about this topic, and the White House is very concerned. This new initiative called Operation TrialBlazer, like clinical trials, TrialBlazer, it is a multi-agency effort, and it does a lot to try to encourage domestic manufacturing and also shave some time off of the clinical trial development process here in the United States. So they think that some of the changes that they proposed for the Food and Drug Administration can cut the process by 6 to 12 months. One thing that they're doing is trying to just improve communications. It's a pretty basic thing, but sometimes companies don't really know what the FDA wants. And so they are doing a number of different steps to try to change that. A lot of companies sometimes give the FDA more data than is actually necessary, and that wastes time and money at that early stage. So they've put up a new website, they have a new call center, they're doing a series of roundtable discussions, they are making it clear that companies can reuse data in terms of manufacturing and safety studies for their new products, and they're streamlining some of the investigational new drug requirements and getting rid of some animal testing that they find unnecessary. Those are just some of the things. Another thing is that they are also building more flexibility into the initial clinical trial protocols so that there isn't really the need to go and get approval for amendments quite as often. And that can save some time as well. And then they're trying to make sure that when there are amendments that are needed, that it doesn't slow down the trial. And that's just a piece of it. This is a very multi-pronged approach.
Yeah, thanks for the update, Rebecca. So when we talk about early stage work, Jocelyn, do you think these policy moves are going to actually make a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a critically needed and the right move, to start really looking at the IND process in particular. Currently can take up to 12 months to get a trial started, the first in human study, and we anticipate this would cut that time significantly, if all of these efforts were implemented. So a really great first step from the administration. I think we also have to look at the way that IRBs are dealt with. There's some really good proposals there. We've also seen some proposals from Representative Auchincloss to advance a point of care network, which would really bring trials to patients in the communities where they're living and where they're seeking care more regularly. We need to have more decentralized studies so that patients who are in rural communities and other things can participate as well. So I think it's going to take a number of different approaches, but these moves on the IND process in particular at FDA will be very meaningful.
Thomas, do you agree?
It could be. So the one thing I would say is I would agree with both Rebecca and Jocelyn that there's a lot that's exciting here. This is meant to get at what we had been talking about previously about improving U.S. competitiveness and regulatory efficiency. The reality is the U.S. is not just losing clinical trial activity to China, it's losing it to places like Australia and Norway as well. And well-regulated settings that people don't have concerns about. And these proposals borrow some of the good innovations from those settings, particularly around first-in-human trial efficiencies, trying to reduce the regulatory burden, the pre-meeting communication that Rebecca referenced, the CMC controls, and trying to streamline much of that. So all that is quite positive. There's also an effort to leverage other U.S. agencies like NIH and its clinical
Right.
trial
Can you talk a
network.
little
So
bit
all
about that?
there. But
Yeah.
sure. So one of the things that's exciting about the NIH program is that they do seem perhaps inspired by the Norway model, and that they are looking at its clinical trial networks that they have set up, particularly around cancer, and what can be done to improve access to those clinical trials in rural settings, to try to have more streamlining on the IRB process, to build up centers of excellence in a way that has proven quite successful for Norway. So all that is good. The one thing I want to say that's important for the audience to understand is the vast majority of what's proposed in Operation TrialBlazer is proposals, non-binding draft guidance, requests for information, voluntary pilots, as opposed to final and binding law. FDA has been a fairly chaotic institution over the last year, so I want to temper expectations a bit because we're still at the early days of this. It's a really positive step, but there's a lot the agency has to do to get its own house in order, and much of this, again, is still voluntary and proposed as opposed to final binding law.
That's a really important point, Thomas. Rebecca, another area of focus is ethical reviews. What changes is HHS aiming to make there?
Yes, thanks for bringing that up. And Thomas and Jocelyn alluded to this. So the institutional review boards are there to protect humans. They were put in place decades ago just to make sure that there are not abuses and to make sure that patients really know what they're signing up for, that there's informed consent. But the challenge is that over the decades, a lot of these institutional review boards, or IRBs, they have gotten a lot of power, and some people feel like they really slow down the process in some ways. HHS said that and the budget contract negotiations can add 13 months before a patient is even enrolled in a clinical trial. And so what they're trying to do is to streamline that. They said that they might come out with a rule that will update the institutional review board process and say things like, if you have a clinical trial going on with multiple sites, does every local board need to come in and make its own ethical judgment? Or should it just be one umbrella agreement for all of those different sites, and they would have just one and make it easier? And they also are encouraging, the FDA is encouraging this process to start earlier in the process. So those are a couple of the different ways that they're looking at IRB reform.
We can transition to talk a little bit about the impact of Operation TrialBlazer. Jocelyn, how are these, Thomas said that these are kind of pending changes and not full policy changes yet. But if they are adopted, how do you think it will impact pharmaceutical companies and patients?
Yeah, Thomas's point is very well taken. Implementation is critically important. Pharma is commenting on these RFIs, reviewing guidance, and then, yes, we have to make sure that these things are being followed. The PDUFA process itself, has a lot of goals within it so that it ensures that their FDA is being held accountable to the timelines and to the guidance and things. So it does take time to make sure, but I think the initial impression from the industry is that these are important, meaningful improvements should they be implemented correctly. A lot of the areas for improvement, again, being able to get your IND completed and start enrolling patients. If we can overcome some of the issues around IRBs, as Rebecca said, sometimes negotiating hospital by hospital contracting, there are a lot of ideas here that we can use to create some significant efficiencies, and I think the industry would welcome that. So again, I think we see it as a very positive move, but it has to be consistently addressed we have to stay focused on these issues and continue to drive implementation for us to really see the benefit over time.
Mm-hmm. And Rebecca, one of the issues that we've been following very closely here at WP Intelligence, it's some of the hollowing out of government agencies. You've kept an eye on the FDA particularly. Do they have the person power to keep pace with an acceleration of drug approvals?
Well, I just got the quarterly update from the Food and Drug Administration, and they continue to have a net loss of employees. And as Thomas mentioned, there have been challenges for the agency in the past year, and we are continuing to see that. People are leaving. These are people with a lot of skills that can translate to the private sector, and they have other options. And so, for example, when we look at the two main centers, the drug center and the biologics center, you can see the decline in personnel over time. And we saw that at the beginning of fiscal 25, there were more than 6,000 employees at the drug center, and now there are fewer than 5,000. So that makes a big difference.
That is a huge difference. Thomas, what other options does the federal government have to better keep pace with potential AI drug discoveries and the acceleration in China?
So the other area where we're seeing many proposals, and I think Jocelyn referenced this at least implicitly, but is again on the defensive side. So there are many proposals. There was out of the China Select Committee, the chairman sent a letter to various pharmaceutical companies expressing concerns about where and how clinical trials are being conducted in China, calling for greater FDA scrutiny. There have been policy proposals discussed to delay the acceptance of clinical trial data from China for a year. There are people talking about having it designated a country of concern and not to accept clinical trial data from there at all. So there are many conversations like that. There are also efforts in US regulatory agencies to give greater scrutiny to licensing transactions in the biotechnology space with China and to enable changes under the COINS Act to make that easier to have that level of scrutiny. So there are many proposals happening out there. This is definitely a space worth watching.
For sure. We do have another audience question that I wanted to throw out to you all. What safeguards are going to be set in place to make sure the reduced drug development timeline will not create data quality and integrity issues? How will this impact pharmaceutical company requirements for reports and inspections by the FDA?
I can take
Jocelyn,
it first.
Yeah,
sure. Yeah. I think this is a question that started to come up during COVID. Does speed necessarily mean a concern about quality? And I think the thing to keep in mind in the drug development process is that the drug development is the entire R&D process is the most highly regulated process that we have. FDA oversight is at every step along the way. We were talking about institutional review boards. That is part of good clinical practice, which we also had mentioned. There are global standards with the International Conference of Harmonization. China is indeed a member of ICH and has also committed to implementing those same global best practices on the conduct of clinical trials. Sponsors of studies, when they conduct them, have to ensure that patients are being appropriately consented. They have to keep data from patients and protect it. And FDA has authority to inspect clinical sites, manufacturing sites, to look at every piece of data submitted as part of an investigational new drug application or as a marketing application. So that means that there are many safeguards, many eyes on the process, many checks along the way. Now, the question is to ensure that FDA is fully utilizing its authority, as I said before, and to continue to hold regulators around the world accountable for the standards that they have agreed to uphold, including China and others. But there are plenty of safeguards. So speed is being driven by efficiencies, by the number of patients that are available in China, especially treatment naive patients in many cases, and other factors. So we can't just assume it's a quality issue.
I think the issue, and Jocelyn referenced this, is does the FDA have the resources and the inclination to exercise those authorities? And this has been an area they've struggled historically. And in terms of the rapid shift of clinical trial activity, in 2 dimensions, a risk-based approach would suggest you would continue to have these concerns in China, given past concerns around data validity from some Chinese trials that we have seen, but also just the volume of trials that are happening over there. China now leads the world globally in clinical trial registrations in 2024, up to more than 7,000 compared to approximately 6,000 in the US. You would want to see a corresponding increase in the FDA oversight for both those historical reasons as well as that volume, and we haven't. So the question is what's the best way to ensure that as part of this? As again, from our perspective, meaning the group that put forward this report, you need both offensive and defensive measures here. We need to invest in the US having the best science, but we also need to ensure the science that is coming from elsewhere is also of equal quality and ensures the safety of US patients.
I want to switch gears to talk about what's ahead. We did discuss earlier that the US still has a lead, 70% of novel drugs. China is at 30%. Where do you guys see this kind of ratio going in the next 5 years? And what needs to be done from the US perspective to be able to kind of keep its dominance?
I can start, and then I know Thomas will have ideas as well. But I think, as we said, this has to be a comprehensive approach. We need to be looking at FDA reform, infrastructure, funding for science, make sure the workforce, which we haven't talked as much about. We talked about FDA workforce, but it's also the scientists that are able to run the studies, our academic sites, the pipeline of talent. The U.S. does have a STEM workforce gap, and if we're not careful, that could grow. Right now, China is graduating about 100,000 more STEM, PhD, and master students each year over the United States, and they are actively recruiting scientists back to China. So we need to be looking at all of the drivers of innovation, protecting intellectual property, and I would be remiss not to also add that we need to ensure that the U.S. remains a market that incentivizes and rewards innovation, so that there continues to be a market here that can drive best-in-class science. The U.S. has moved recently to expanded price controls. We know there are persistent issues in the margins for generic medicines, which impacts their reliability. So we have to look at all of the policy levers and really think comprehensively about how we support best-in-class science and an innovative industry.
Thomas,
I'll just add on a little bit. Absolutely. And those are great points. So you really need to see a combination of demand and supply measures in this space. Jocelyn referenced a lot of good measures on the supply side. How do we make sure the US has the best science so that we are generating clinical trial activity at home, investing in innovative products? We do need to see on the demand side leveraging U.S. strengths in that regard. We are the largest pharmaceutical market in the world. We do have government purchasing programs through CMS, the VA, DoD. We haven't historically done a good enough job leveraging that market power to encourage U.S. and allied production of critical essential medicines. On the allied production, the U.S. can't do this all on its own. It is also not the only country confronting this dynamic of concern on dependence on China in these sectors. So we have to look where we can, and this is true on the generic side and upstream inputs, as well as in the biotechnology side, how we can work with allied nations to do more in this space. There's already some efforts leveraging NATO or other groupings to look at countermeasures. We could certainly look at innovative biotechnology products in the same lens and what we can do to work together. The last point I'll just make here is how quickly this can turn. The US does have a lead for innovative products, but truthfully, it wasn't that long ago we had a lead for generic products as well. As recently as 2008, US administered amoxicillin was almost all domestically manufactured. That has shifted entirely abroad relatively quickly. It will not take long for the same to occur in the biotech space, absent these kinds of interventions. But we really have to start thinking a little more holistically. So the supply, the demand, and then some of the defensive measures that we've been talking about too.
Can I bring in another topic just on the supply side? Federal research dollars have been inconsistent in the past couple of years, and we currently see a pending proposal at the Office of Management and Budget that would allow political actors to have more control over federal grants and be able to terminate federal grants even after they've been awarded. I know this is a little bit adjacent to what we're talking about, but I wonder how you all think about that and how that affects the talent that we have here in the United States. Jocelyn, do you have thoughts on that? Or sorry, Thomas, you were about to move forward.
I can start, but I think NIH funding is an important upstream factor for private sector investment in biopharmaceutical innovation. And as I mentioned, they are a key driver of the talent pipeline that we rely on in the sciences. So we want to have a sense of stability in that research infrastructure. And so wholesale changes to research funding that would make it would kind of change where the authority for funding decisions lie, and to provide more authority for the cancellation of studies rather than just on non-performance, which is the current process, could introduce a level of unpredictability that could have some chilling effects on the desire of students to try to seek federal funding, to go into the sciences. It could, with a lot of downstream effects, I think that could have some real negative implications for our ability to continue to lead and to stay competitive.
So the U.S., there's a lot I'm sorry, go ahead. I was just going to add quickly on that. There's a lot the U.S. can learn from China, but we don't have to become China-like to succeed. We have to remember what has made the U.S. so dominant historically in the biotechnology space, and it's the combination of great basic research, often federally funded in the university sector, capital, venture capital, and a robust pharmaceutical industry that commercializes the best products and brings them to patients. And we need to emphasize those strengths. And Rebecca, you get at an issue that is undermining one of the pillars of the U.S. biopharmaceuticals sector, and one of the areas that has made us great historically. So I am watching those changes with some concern, to the extent that they are undermining what we have historically seen from academia and in terms of basic research and the benefits it's brought to US patients, but really the world. So it's worth watching.
I'm curious so going back to the China model and what works really well, and the Trump administration has actually been investing in some stakes in critical sectors like technology. It's got a 10% stake in Intel. Do you think that that kind of a model where the government takes an equity stake in companies in order to speed up development and investment so they become more competitive, could that potentially be a model for us going forward? Jocelyn, you're smiling, so.
It's an interesting question. I think that that is a new way of thinking about industrial policy, in particular for a Republican administration.
But we do have a lot of examples where the current administration is using this strategy to make sure that the U.S. remains competitive in many different industries.
There are. And, I think in particular on some of the supply chain vulnerabilities on the essential medicines list, there could really be a role for the government to provide some, to step in areas where there are real market failures. We may need to do advanced purchasing agreements or other kinds of things to bolster that market there. So there could be some very appropriate, tailored policies that could solve some problems, especially on the essential medicines. So I think it is something worth looking at and discussing. But it is, and clearly there is a willingness in this administration to look at those kinds of tools.
Great. Just to build on that, I think there's a lot to be said for the industrial policy interventions Jocelyn just mentioned, volume guarantees, advanced purchasing. We have had historically, and we saw this during COVID, a less great track record in terms of US equity investments in the biopharmaceutical space panning out the way we've wanted them to. And obviously we saw, again, some problems during the pandemic. So I would be a little bit more cautious there, but there are definitely a range of industrial policy tools that are worth considering, and it's again, worth being innovative in their application.
What about partnerships? Because we know that US companies are partnering with Chinese companies to speed up clinical trials. Do you guys foresee more partnership opportunities going forward for US companies in China?
I mean, I think right now there's significant energy in doing so. As I said, I think in the short run in particular, there's a lot of competitive advantage to the US being able to partner in China, because US companies remain involved in the development. They can control those medicines. We know we can ensure that US patients will get access to them. And so there's real benefit and even a national security and economic security benefit from doing so. As we look at the environment, if US companies were not able to license or partner with Chinese companies, that would not stop China from continuing to drive towards becoming a powerhouse biopharmaceutical sector. They would be able to, they would find other markets. They would certainly take advantage of the US not being able to be involved in that market and partner, and would find other ways. So I don't see that US pulling out or overly restricting those partnerships would be beneficial. That said, where there are clear national security concerns, government has a lot of tools. They put policies into place. Biosecure, the Department of Justice has some data exportation requirements. So there are policies that have been put in place, and there are more policy conversations going on, absolutely. Certainly COINS Act implementation is ongoing. But I just think we need to be very careful and thoughtful about our approach here, because there are currently benefits to that licensing and partnership.
Rebecca, sorry, Thomas, did you have anything to add?
No, I was just going to say, I think there's going to be some real uncertainty in that space, particularly around licensing and clinical trials. There are going to continue to be congressional initiatives in this regard, and it will be interesting to see what impact that starts to have on industry, that uncertainty of where we might be going on these regulatory initiatives. I do think we're heading to an environment where we will see more scrutiny, whether that results in the kind of decoupling that Jocelyn was saying could be possible in the space and might have some adverse effects. I'm not sure, but I think there is a real prospect of increased scrutiny, and I don't know how that shifts licensing activity and clinical trial activity in China if companies start to bake that in their decision making.
Can I ask a little bit about the role of Congress? Jocelyn, I know some drug companies are concerned that some policies that are being discussed are a little too protectionist. I'm wondering if you all can talk a little bit more about what you see actually happening in Congress. There are different ways that laws could make its way through the legislative route. One is the Defense Authorization, another is the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which has to be renewed, and another is the annual spending laws. So just looking at those different scenarios, and what do you think realistically has a chance of making it across the finish line?
I mean, there's no question, as Thomas said, that the scrutiny is increasing, and I don't see that dissipating. A lot of questions are being asked, and I think that this is a bipartisan issue where folks are looking at this, whether it's clinical trials, supply chain dependency, licensing, investment. It is clear to us that there is significant interest. So yes, I think we are keeping a close eye on all of those policy vehicles. NDAA has in the past led to the Biosecure Act and the Coins Act. That policy process is going right now. So I absolutely agree with Thomas that there's no question that this continues to be a discussion. But I think, our cautionary tale to policymakers is that rather than the protectionist side of this, we really need to think about the U.S. ecosystem part of it and ensure that we are paying most, if not all, of our attention to this side of the problem, because that is really what's driving a lot of these factors over time. We need to make the U.S. environment work, optimally, and so there's so much work to be done on that space. The protectionist pieces where there are real legitimate national security concerns, we absolutely have to be careful about that, and in particular on the KSMs and dependencies there. But I think we have to be cautious about moving too quickly on the protectionist side because there would be a lot of unintended consequences.
Rebecca, what are you working on next for our subscribers?
Well, I'm looking at a few things. One, I would like to look more at this Office of Management and Budget proposal that affects all federal grants. It really changes the grant-making process for every agency. It's a very comprehensive proposed rule, and the comments are due next week, so I am taking a look at that. I'm also looking at Medicaid policies. There is a rule that's out related to work requirements, and I'm taking a look at that as well. And I'm also interested in global health and what's happening with funding that Congress has appropriated, but the administration has not yet sent out. So those are three things that if people want to share information with me on, they should definitely get in touch with me.
Great. And Thomas and Jocelyn, what are you guys watching next in terms of policy moves and drug discovery?
Yeah, I think we're keeping an eye on all of these end of the year spending bills, reauthorizations, watching closely all the things we just discussed. And then, of course, we'll see what happens with the elections and where the focus is in healthcare next year, because it does seem that there's a lot of energy in the healthcare space on all the issues Rebecca mentioned and many more. So,
great for us. Thank you. It's really, the report just came out, so we are still engaging with policymakers on that. We have two hearings next week, one before the Senate Aging Committee, another vote for the Energy and Commerce Committee that will include portions around the report. So we're going to be watching these issues very closely. Certainly the policy processes that Jocelyn mentioned, and also, again, of course, to get to our topic today on the Operation TrialBlazer and how that gets implemented as well. And exciting to hear about Rebecca's focus on global health. That's certainly something else that we will be watching, and how that money is spent. So those will be our initiatives in the future.
Well, thank you so much for your insights today, Rebecca, Jocelyn, and Thomas. It was great to have you. Everything that you've mentioned today, these are all issues that we will continue to cover at Washington Post Intelligence. Before we wrap, a quick reminder that you can request a WP Intelligence platform demo by clicking on the link on your screen, and we'll send our live audience a link to the recording of today's briefing very shortly. Please do take a moment to complete the short post-briefing survey. Your feedback directly shapes what we cover next. And next Friday, July 17th, my colleague Louisa Savage will sit down with Benjamin Guggenheim, author of our AI and Tech Brief newsletter, to discuss the future of quantum computing and a new executive order. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next week.